Hi everyone. This video is aimed at assisting you in working on the task called Work in Australian Society, which is aimed at looking at the role and contribution of volunteers in sport generally. There are 3 steps involved. I'm actually going to talk mainly about preparing the report, which will help you then hopefully to develop the interview questions, which is step 1. And conduct the interview, but the report itself should dictate what kinds of questions that you might use. I would suggest definitely no more than 10, and if you want to interview 1 or more people, that's totally okay. Basically, this person, it's not their life story we want to know, but instead it's going to be just a way of getting you starting to think about the actual role of volunteers and some of the issues that come up with it. You'll notice in the sheet that there are some suggestions here of what we want you to cover, and I'm going to go into more detail of that today. But also you can see that we're looking for your understanding of knowledge and skills, your understanding and explanation of issues that are related, and the investigation will come from obviously your interview and any other research that you involve within this task. So I'm going to cut straight to a sheet that I've made up here, which in fact I think we can work through today. I want you to know that the possible subheadings, which are listed here, will in many ways formulate the questions that you are going to ask of your interviewee. When you first begin this task, like most, I'd like an introduction. In that introduction, you'll cover what sport you're involved in. You'll perhaps mention who you're interviewing, and you may put some general details about how many volunteers there are in sport with some statistics. Those statistics may come from your particular sport, or they just might be sport in general. I'd also like you to mention if you've personally volunteered in sport or even in another field. To give you an idea of what that introduction might look like, you'll see here a student has included an image of not great relevance, but they have explained who they're going to interview, the fact of the role of this person, and a little bit of information about the, if you like, body that he works within, which happens to be South Australian Water Polo. Another student has done an introduction that I'd like to show you, and here this student has talked about the fact that volunteers are the lifeblood of Australian cricket, so they've made it very specific to cricket. They've also given a definition of what volunteering is, and then gone on to say that what this report's going to basically discuss, including the fact that this student did in fact interview several volunteers. And you'll notice up here with a footnote reference there, they have in fact done some research beyond just the interview. If you do, please make sure you reference who you've used, and then later of course they will appear in your bibliography. So once you've done that introduction, then basically what I want you to do is to move on to discuss the roles and responsibilities within your sport, of which, whether they be paid or unpaid. Several sports such as SANFL football are mainly paid workers, and in some respects it is perhaps more difficult to find a volunteer, whilst others such as Taekwondo, I know, is pretty much all volunteer based. To show perhaps what roles do exist and perhaps what their responsibilities are, some students have chosen to demonstrate that through perhaps some kind of a flow chart, which you can see here. Unfortunately, we can't tell which ones are paid and which ones aren't, and that's something that another student actually managed to show very well, this time through a table. So we can see that there is the paid workers here and the volunteers here, and the student has listed the role being president, age group coach, team manager, and some of their responsibilities. Another good way of showing what happens within your sport, because each of them are very different. And lastly, we have a bit of a flow chart here that the student has said this is a diagram showing the paid and unpaid workers, and paid are in blue and volunteers in green. So it's very clear, and with it also including some of their roles. So it's a really good way, I think, of giving us an idea of what happens in your sport. Moving back then, once you've discussed a little bit about the roles and responsibilities, a natural area you will need to cover at some point is what are the advantages and the value of volunteering, both for the volunteer but also for the institution. I hope that I'm going to read more than just volunteering is good for the volunteer because it makes them feel good, because that is very relevant, but there are many other advantages for a volunteer, and that's what I'm hoping to see from you. You might find that answer from your interview, but you may also find it elsewhere. Going on to the institution, obviously a very obvious one would be that they get free labour. They don't have to pay the person. That may be the only advantage you can think of. I'm sure there will be some disadvantages, and that's where we will move on later when we talk about the issues within sport. I do want you to use subheadings. These are not strict subheadings to use, but they are just suggestions, and as I said, they may help you to formulate a question, such as where I suggest that one of the work-related issues involved in volunteering that you should be discussing is about attracting and retaining volunteers. Why not ask your volunteer, how did you get involved? How does your club gain and attract more volunteers as time goes on? And how do they keep them? How do they retain them? How do they train them? So these sorts of questions can be asked of your volunteer, and also you may find more out from just your own knowledge as well. So some of the issues that I'd expect you to cover would be around the working relationships. For example, how do the paid and the unpaid workers get along? And do the volunteers in fact have a good relationship within the club? That might move on naturally to what are the politics of the workplace? Does the volunteer in fact feel valued? Are they given a lot of authority or very little? It might depend on the sport you're involved in. We really want to know also, from the club's point of view, as I said, how they attract and retain them, how they recognise volunteers and give them any feedback or recognition, but also looking at some of the unpopular tasks perhaps that are involved in your club. And from the point of view of the volunteer, I'd want you to discuss things about volunteer skill levels and knowledge. Do they have them? Did they gain them? How do they gain them? Also, what are their rights? Keeping in mind that every worker has rights, whether they're paid or not, and how is that, I suppose, catered for in a volunteering capacity. These are really most of the issues I expect, and a very important one, of course, is the impact that volunteering has on the individual and on their work-life balance. For some people, it's very positive. If your interviewee says, yeah, volunteering's great, never interferes with my home or social life in any way, that doesn't mean, of course, that all volunteers find it a very positive experience or that it has no negative impacts. So make sure that when you are discussing the impact, that it's not necessarily just from the point of view of your interviewee. I suspect that if you've covered most of these, then you will definitely have completed your report. Finally, of course, there are two things that I would like. One of them mainly is the conclusion, of course, and I would expect you to conclude by saying how important volunteering is. And also, if you have any experiences, please talk about them. I have a nice example here of a student who in fact was a volunteer. By the way, that is his demonstration of the roles and responsibilities, and he's used a colour system. Red is for paid employees and blue is volunteer, and the blacks are paid as well. The red ones, sorry, have got volunteering expectations. So he's done a really good flowchart. But moving down to the end of his report, you'll see that he has experience as a volunteer. So he spends some, let's see, 200 words odd on explaining his own experience as a volunteer, and then finally he kind of sums up what he's learnt about volunteering. And in most cases, many students in this task come out at the end saying, wow, you know, I probably took them for granted and I now feel I have a better indication. Some of the things that you need to know about this task generally, some important points, is that you must include a copy of the transcript of the interview. if the interview is done by email, and this student here that I showed you, no, actually I haven't shown you, but I will now. She actually interviewed 3 people, and she's put it in as an appendix, which makes perfect sense. They're her 8 questions, and the answers are below. She did it through an email, so she was able to get the answers in text form. And you'll notice here the answers are a little more complex from another member of the swimming club. And finally, she also interviewed a secretary that gave a little more detail as well. So if you're doing it via email, it's very easy to include the copy. If you record it, please do not transcribe every word they say. Just some notes will be sufficient, because we're not judging you on the standard of interviewee answers. You may get some people that don't write very much, so you will have to, of course, then use your own understanding of volunteering. Lastly, of course, if you do refer to any internet sites or brochures or any other secondary sources, including the person you interview really should be in your bibliography. So going back to what is expected, as I said, a copy of the transcript, please. If necessary, just take a photo with your phone of the page if it was done by handwriting, and you can attach that as an image. There should be a reference list, as I said, including the person you interviewed. You can keep it anonymous if you choose, and any sites and any references that you use to do your report. There is no word limit, so I don't expect it would not be as long as some of the reflections you did. So don't make it a 5,000 word essay or report. I do want you to include a front or cover page too, because I think it just enhances the look of the overall report. So and one other thing I haven't included here is that you can use photographs if you choose. I've said before to you that doesn't mean you'll get extra points, but what it will show is sometimes something you want to demonstrate. And here, quite interestingly, all of these volunteers have obviously been provided with clothing. That was my first observation here. So in fact, volunteers are often needing to be trained. They may need to be clothed in a certain way. They may need to be given meals. So there are obligations by the club to the volunteer, and that's something you may want to discuss as well. So overall, the questions need to be put together. You can show them to me if you choose. They're not as important, of course, as the actual report that you will write up once you've done the interview. But the interview is to get you thinking. If you have any further questions, I suggest you watch this video again. But if there's still anything that needs clarified, emailing's the best way to get in touch with me. And good luck. This task, of course, will be due before the end of the year, which is most likely I'll need it in the first couple of weeks of term 4. But you can certainly be in touch with me about the absolute final cutoff. And good luck.